Oh, there's the bell. The clock and the bell are off. Anyway, I wanted to start up where I left off last time, but first, do you have any questions before I get going? Okay. Well, as I recall, last time we were talking about the difference between the man of the ultimate man of virtue, Cesare Borgia, and this other example that Machiavelli uses, Agathocles, the ancient Syracusan. And we know that Cesare Borgia is the ideal. And he's the ideal because he took every circumstance that he had, both good and bad, and used them to his advantage. And he had the prudence, the understanding of human nature, to be able to do violence when necessary, but to use someone else to do it, to distance himself from that violence. Okay? And in doing so, he accomplished the pacification of this area, the Romagna, but he was avoiding being hated. He was not hated by the people because this other man had done it. And yet he accomplished the necessary element of fear, which Machiavelli believes people must have in order to remain obedient or law-abiding. But then Borgia set up courts of justice and a stable government. And so in Machiavelli's mind, that was just masterful. He had done it all. And his only problem was, well, he died. He died too young to be able to accomplish everything he possibly could do. Now, in this case, this is a slide about Agathocles, and this is where we left off. And Agathocles wanted to take over Syracuse, but he wasn't in a position to do so legally. And so he called this assembly of all the nobles, all the notable people in Syracuse, and had them killed, using Carthaginian troops as his accomplices. And so in the wake of this really bloodbath, in which he kills everybody who could possibly oppose him, then Machiavelli says he ruled without controversy. And yet he says he cannot be completely praised. And I read you this before, but just for emphasis, thinking about what he said about Borgia, it might be kind of surprising to hear him say that he cannot be praised completely. He says one cannot or ought not, of course, to call it virtu or virtue or manliness, to massacre one's fellow citizens, to betray one's friends, to break one's word, to be without mercy and without religion. By such means one can acquire power, but not glory. So there he adds that element of glory. And this is something that Machiavelli really values. Now, you might ask yourself, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but it probably bears repeating, Borgia did all those things. Why is it that now Agathocles can't do these things and receive the same praise, at least from Machiavelli? Because Borgia massacred people, but he did it through Diorco, his second in command. He betrayed Diorco. That's a clear, betrayal of somebody that you've made a sort of contract with in order to do a job. And I'm sure that Diorco expected compensation, not to be killed. So he's done that. To break his word, well, Borgia was very capable of breaking his word to him and to others. He did things using deception with people, so he is not above lying. To be without mercy and without religion. Well, Borgia was all of those things. He did all of those things, and yet Machiavelli says he is to be praised, as a man of great virtue. But yet here, Agathocles does these things and he's not. But there's this added element where he says, but by such means one can acquire power, but not glory. And that's probably key to understanding what it is that makes the difference here. Because Borgia was able to acquire glory, or he could have. Glory means admiration from others. And he put himself in a position where the people of the Romagna could look up to him or respect him, and maybe even eventually, more than respect him, praise him for creating a stable government. Previously, we had robbers and bandits and people preying upon the citizens of this land. He comes in, yes, this mistake happens, but in the long run, he creates stable government, law and order for these people. They're going to be a lot better off a few years from now. In Machiavelli's view, remember, people look at the outcome and not the means. If the outcome is good, eventually they forget the means if they were ever concerned with that. Okay? So eventually, Borgia might be seen as a sort of founder figure. Okay? Especially if he had continued to live and continued to build upon that success. And he might really have been looked back on as somebody who was worthy of that kind of praise. Agathocles can't be. Okay? He didn't do it the right way. And this is something that Machiavelli is very concerned with, is there's a right way and a wrong way to do things. And it doesn't have to do with morality, but you have to be smart. Because your ultimate goal is to have people obey you because they want to. Because if you don't have that, you're going to have constant worries. You're going to be in that position of the dictator that Socrates spoke of, where he's constantly worried about people taking revenge upon him, revolting against him. Machiavelli knows that's not a good position to be in either. Okay? So, but for him, it's all about self-interest. It's better to have people obey you because they want to rather than because they hate you and fear you and so forth. So this is what he means by such means one can acquire power but not glory. It's better to have that acceptance, which we now in political science water down and sort of bleed out as legitimacy. Okay? But that's what Machiavelli is talking about, is the acceptance of the people. Okay? And so Agathocles, he's associated with that violence because he's right there. Everybody knows that he did that and that this is the only way that he can rule. And you get the sense that somebody like Agathocles is going to continue to rule that way by threat of force and violence. Not only is that, inefficient, but it's very likely to backfire. Okay? So Machiavelli is truly about thinking about how things work best. And that's why he has this value of cruelty well used. Okay? Borgia used cruelty well. Agathocles did not. They both used it, but one used it with the result of acquiescence, of true obedience, and even gratitude. And the other used it in a way that would lead people to hate and suspect and constantly try to figure out how to escape from this type of leadership. Okay? So Machiavelli knows that too much cruelty can backfire and create hatred. And later on in the book, he makes this a point. He makes a point of emphasizing this, that there's a difference between being feared and being hated. Okay? And when people hate you, they lose control. Okay? Fear can control people, but when it gets to the point of hatred, they lose that. And they will risk their lives just to get you. Okay? So Machiavelli wants cruelty to not be the product of emotion, like anger or love of power or anything like that, but he actually wants a prince who can sit back and rather calculatedly decide whether cruelty and what kind of cruelty will achieve a desirable end. Now that seems, certainly is from a moral perspective wrong. Okay, but Machiavelli believes that when you're in a leadership position, you shouldn't have the luxury of dealing with those types of moral niceties. You've been put in a position where effectiveness is everything. And so, for that very reason, you have a responsibility to think about how to use cruelty, among other things, in order to achieve ends that are going to be both good for you and good for the people as a result. Okay? There is a requirement here, and this is hard to find. And this is one of the potential weaknesses of Machiavelli's theory. It's a big potential weakness. Okay? In order to in order to make this work, you have to find a leader who is smart enough to understand this type of advice and not let his emotions interfere. And also is just smart enough to strategize, okay? But definitely to not let his emotions interfere with his decision making. And also somebody who will take risks and is bold enough to do some of these things and isn't hampered by moral issues or by religious questions and so forth. And when you think about those two qualifications, there's not that many people that fit this description, okay? You might find more people in the area of boldness, although boldness and rashness are two different things. Rash people abound, they just do things because they want to at the moment. But boldness is a sort of courage, the courage it takes to take that chance and to go ahead and execute a plan and to not be worried about moral or religious scruples. Well, there are people like that, okay? But then you got to find somebody who actually understands long-term strategic thinking and, can think in terms of rational self-interest in the long run instead of the short run, and you get fewer people, okay? So how many leaders will actually be able to really follow Machiavelli's advice? Well, this is one of the problems of realism, is that people take away what they want to from a teaching like this. And they may adopt some of the strategies and some of the ideas of a thinker like Machiavelli, but not be able to fully do so. And if they don't fully do so, then the outcomes are going to be different. Because I think Machiavelli wanted the outcomes to be stability for Italy. He wanted to unify Italy. He wanted to make people safer and more prosperous, and he thought this was the route to it. But it hinges upon whether you can find a leader that really understands that would be to his advantage. Okay? And he very well knows that there's a lot of people out there that are not like that. That's why he's written this book. Okay? So, in a way, this is a realist that's taking a kind of long shot here. And we tend to not think of realism this way, but as I've worked with it over the years, I've realized it really is a long shot. Realist thinkers say the world is really like this, and yet it's not. If it were like this, if people thought this way, we wouldn't need realists telling people how to think rationally and remember what their true priorities ought to be. Okay? So that's a definite potential weakness there to keep in mind. What Machiavelli is trying to do is what many realists try to do. They try to lower the horizons or lower our expectations. Remember, Plato had high expectations. He knew that we couldn't fulfill them typically, but he thought that his role was to urge us to be better. Okay? The realist lowers those horizons and sets goals that he thinks we can achieve most of the time. Okay? And so we see Machiavelli as one of the founding realists because he sets these standards and he creates this foundation for future political thought. And a lot of modern political thought stems from these assumptions about human nature that he develops here. So, for instance, John Locke, one of the liberal thinkers who greatly influenced the American founders, had basically realist assumptions about human nature and agreed a lot with somebody like Machiavelli on what that constituted. That human beings were selfish individuals most of the time, that government was for restraining them and their desires to interfere with other people's rights and so forth. He took off in the direction of constitutional government, but then Machiavelli liked that too. Both of them thought it would work better to harness people's desires for freedom and profit and those kind of things. But they didn't assume that their role was to try to make people morally better. Okay? So Machiavelli has a lot in common with a lot of modern thinkers. And that theme of low but solid continues throughout modern political thought. Low expectations, but a solid foundation. Okay? This is just something I wanted to mention briefly as a third point of view, a third interpretation of Machiavelli. We talked more about Machiavelli as a sort of teacher of evil. That's the critique of Machiavelli. We've talked about Machiavelli as objective reporter, but there is this third view of Machiavelli that primarily his motivation was to improve the people's lives, to unify Italy, to make people more prosperous and secure. Okay? And to that end, he then asked, well, what needs to be done? Well, we can't have all these Italian principalities and cities fighting with each other. And we can't have these nations from outside coming in and invading. We have to create order, and this is how to do it. So, especially towards the end of the book, we find that patriotic theme comes out. But in chapter 9, we get our taste of that. I guess maybe in some ways a first taste of that. Okay. Chapter 9 is about how the prince can have favor with the people, or can find their approval, so to speak. Now, I don't know if it kind of surprised you that somebody like Machiavelli would care about this. Okay, but I think from what I've already said, maybe you're beginning to see why. If you don't basically have the backing of the people, then you have to worry about, what they're going to do. Okay? So, in chapter 9, he does argue that the favor of the people is important, and this runs counter to what most of his readers would have thought. Okay? Most people of his day, of the rank that he would be trying to address by this book, saw the world in terms of us versus them. There's us being the aristocracy of noble birth, and them being the common people. Okay? And there's a gulf between the two that is so great that most of the aristocrats didn't think that you could give a guy a weapon from the lower class and expect him to know how to use it. All they were good for was plowing a field and picking onions and things like that. Okay? They couldn't figure out how to stand in formation. They couldn't figure out how to, fight. They didn't have the courage. All those were notions that they thought about the common man. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they tried to control what kind of weapons they could have because, Yeah, right, because they knew that they weren't, in most of these places, the peasants were mistreated. Oftentimes, very badly, and overtaxed for what little they had. And so, the last people you want to have weapons in any sort of organization are the common people. And I'm sure that aristocratic mindset just reinforced that. In other words, from a certain point of view, it validated the rightness of it, the rightness of not allowing these people to become armed. And Machiavelli knew if you did arm them and you did train them, then you couldn't mistreat them like this anymore. Okay? The trade-off would be that the elites would have to treat the common people with more respect, or they would A, not fight for them, and probably B, attack them. Okay? So, the idea of arming the common people in particular would have seemed ludicrous. But, as Machiavelli points out, one big reason why you should think about the people is because their expectations are so much lower. Okay? Now he always thinks like this. Again, they're like, what? What do you mean? Well, the expectations, think about the opposite. The expectations of the nobles, of the wealthy, are very high. And Machiavelli points out, as a matter of fact, endless. Okay? You give them something, they want something else. We already talked about that. Okay? And eventually they just want what you have, basically. They'll never have enough until they take what you have from you as a prince. Whereas the people, okay, they are, for the most part, uneducated. They're poor. They have experienced just an incredible amount of instability. When they go out, they worry about being robbed. Okay, they worry about whether the noble that owns the land that they live on is going to kick them off, or is going to take a greater percentage of what they produce so that they can't even feed their family. Okay, those are the kind of worries that they have. Okay, so for those people, if you just let up on them and allow them to live their lives and keep more of what they produce and not harass them, they're going to be happy. And they're going to be so happy with that, Machiavelli thought they'd be very supportive of such a prince. Then you could trust them, potentially with arms. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. But see, that's the key, is you can never please these people over here. But you definitely can make these people happy. And you do not have to keep giving them and giving them and giving them things. Okay? You have to give them the basic means by which they can help themselves. And they will be so pleased with you. Machiavelli says, as a matter of fact, if you give them more than that, then they too will learn some contempt. Okay? But people are perfectly happy if they feel like they can provide for themselves. So this is something that the prince could give them and still have their respect. Okay? He says on page 34, therefore a prince ought to think of a way whereby his citizens always and in every quality of time have need of the state and of him, and then they will always be faithful to him. Okay? Well, imagine if you've lived your life as a peasant with this radical insecurity and wondering when the noble's going to take what little you have away from you. Okay? Or when he's going to take your daughter, you know. And then someday the government changes and this stops. And you have assurance that when you produce a certain amount from your farm, you only have to give up a certain amount and that's going to stay fixed. Okay? And laws get passed against the abuse of people. Well, you'd want to keep that prince, wouldn't you? You'd feel pretty enthused about that. You know, people love their families, their children in particular, more than anything else in the world. And they want their children to grow up in a world that is safe and in which they can pass what little they have to them. Okay? So who wouldn't feel like that was precious if they happened to live under a regime that provided it when they hadn't before? Okay? So this is the way to win their favor. Okay? So the question that we could ask if we look at Machiavelli as a sort of patriot or lover of the people is he trying to convince, through his various teachings, to convince the prince to see the people in a new light and to shift his attention and focus from the interests of the few to the interests of the many? And if so, does he have an underlying agenda of actually creating a different type of regime? We know that he wrote a book about Republican government at the same time he wrote this. Maybe this is a way in which those two agendas come together, inasmuch as we can see through the prince this repeated theme of the importance of the people. It's hard to overestimate or overstate how new and different that was for a thinker at this time to make that point. Any other questions before we talk about how that translates into military? Yeah.
PBS documentary on the Medici.
Uh-huh.
It seemed to insinuate that the original Cosimo and the original Lorenzo, father and son, did that.
Mm-hmm.
They gave little small, low-interest loans to the commoners, or they exchanged favors for whatever the little peasants could afford so that they could build their support network.
Yeah, they did do a little bit of that. And that may be partly what gave Machiavelli hope that somebody like Lorenzo could actually see the potential of it. They were more innovative, and they were, patrons, as you know, of the scientists and the artists and so forth. They could see the utility in making some changes, in the structure of society. They weren't willing to do anything as radical as what Machiavelli's talking about, but perhaps that was a reason why, that he could see that these were, among other things, thinking people that might be able to listen to an argument. Yeah. Teaches us a lot about Machiavelli's perspective, appears in chapter 6, and has to do with Moses. Okay? Now, Moses was one of the great patriarchs of Judaism and Christianity. Okay? And even of Islam, although Islam would be irrelevant in this context. Okay? Moses was a great figure. He brought the Jewish people the Ten Commandments. All right? And most people of Machiavelli's day were Catholic Christians. Okay? And they believed in Moses and the Bible stories about Moses. All right, so we'll be talking about those. Do we know what Machiavelli's talking about when he refers to Moses? Moses brought not only the Ten Commandments, but Moses in the Bible is shown as doing a lot of miracles, a lot of really spectacular miracles. So, in other words, when Machiavelli deals with Moses, he's dealing with a highly charged figure, somebody that every one of his readers would have known about. None of them would have wanted to say a bad word about. All of them would have been very, feeling reverential about Moses. All right? But Machiavelli deals with Moses not in that way entirely. Okay? He sort of does one of those Machiavellian things where at first he sounds like he's being reverent and humble about Moses, but then he also discusses Moses in a way that devout people would object to. If you take a look at page 19, and that's in chapter 6, the second page in chapter 6, he at first says, obviously we should not discuss Moses' skill, for he was a mere agent following the instructions given him by God. So he should be admired not for his own skill, but for that grace that made him worthy to talk with God. But let us discuss Cyrus and the others who have acquired existing kingdoms or founded new ones. Okay? Now that sounds like, first of all, he's not going to discuss Moses anymore. That's what he says. And the reason why is because he really didn't have skill. All right? He had God's help. All right? So he acknowledges there that what most people think, all right, sounds like he thinks it's true. Moses didn't use his own skill. He used God's power. God used him in a way. Okay? If you're familiar with the story, you know that Moses didn't even want to do any leading. He said, no, I don't want to do that. God insisted. Okay? And actually had to get his brother involved because Moses was uncomfortable doing it by himself. So it would sound like what most people would believe about Moses and what the Bible says, that he was simply following the instructions given him by God. Okay. So you wouldn't expect Machiavelli to talk anymore about Moses, right? Because he just said he's not going to. But then in the next paragraph, he then says, thus it was necessary for Moses to find the people of Israel in Egypt, enslaved and oppressed by the Egyptians, so they, in order to escape from slavery, would be prepared to follow him. And then he follows that with a sentence about another leader. It was essential for Romulus to have no future in Alba. It was appropriate he should have been exposed at birth, otherwise he would not have formed the ambition of becoming king of Rome and succeeding in founding that nation. He mentions Cyrus and the others. All right, so, first of all, we have to notice, hopefully, that he's done what he said he wasn't going to do. Okay? He said, we're not going to talk about Moses because it wasn't skill, but God's instructions that did it. And yet, in the next paragraph, he talks about Moses again. And he talks about Moses in the same way as he talks about the other leaders that he just said are distinguished from him. Romulus, Cyrus, Theseus, and so forth that he gets to. Those are all ancient founders. Romulus is actually a mythical founder of Rome. Probably didn't really exist, right? But Cyrus and Theseus were real people, okay? And he's just said he's not going to do that because that would be equating somebody who did things on a spiritual level with some people who did things at a political level, right? And then he does that. So that kind of makes one think a little bit. What is Machiavelli really saying here? It was necessary for Moses to find the people of Israel in Egypt enslaved and oppressed by the Egyptians. So they, in order to escape from slavery, would be prepared to follow him. How does that make Moses seem? What was he up to? Okay. He's writing about this, so we're talking about it. Okay? Now, what he seems to be saying here is that, Moses saw a situation that he could use. All right? What was that?
To make him look better.
Well, yeah. I mean, he saw a situation that he could exploit or use to make himself look better, to make himself look like a leader, which is totally not the way he's depicted in the Bible story. But still, his language is a little ambiguous. Yeah.
Could you say, like, he was kind of comparing Moses to one of his ideas of taking power, like getting involved in something else, someone else's problem, and you could have capitalized on it?
Exactly. You know, we don't really like to think about it this way, and many of you have been taught the story the way it's written up in the Bible, so it's a little bit jarring to hear somebody say that Moses might have just been sort of taking advantage of a situation, or like you say, hopping into a situation where there's weakness and using it, okay? People were enslaved by the Egyptians. The Hebrews were enslaved by the Egyptians, okay? Which normally would be seen as a complete disaster, okay? A terrible situation. But Machiavelli admires leaders who can look at terrible situations and see them as opportunities, okay? If you can divorce yourself from your feelings about what Machiavelli says about Moses for a second and just see what he's saying about the type of mentality that you have to be a really successful leader. He's trying to teach us something. A successful leader never sees a catastrophe. They always see an opportunity. Okay? You have to be flexible and creative to be a successful leader. All right? So the way Machiavelli sees Moses is he saw a situation of oppression where he could be a leader. All right? Now, that's sort of implied here, but not stated directly. But he does say, now continuing on page 20, something else which contradicts the Bible story. Now, the Bible story says that Moses got the people out of Egypt by using God's miracles. God kept sending plagues on Egypt to scare the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, kept saying, no, I won't let these people go. And then another plague happened and he'd waver. And then he, get stubborn again. But eventually, the people of Israel were allowed to go, and they escaped, and they went across the sea. Moses parted the sea for them, and all these miracles happened. Well, he doesn't sound like he did that through the use of an army in the Bible story. It sounds like, God was the only army Moses had. Okay? But if you take a look at page 20, Machiavelli sees it differently. He says, when he can stand on his own feet and can resort to force, then the prince can usually overcome the dangers he faces. Thus it is that all armed prophets are victorious and disarmed ones are crushed. For there is another problem. People are by nature inconstant. It is easy to persuade them of something, but it is difficult for them to stop them from changing their minds. So you have to be prepared for the moment when they no longer believe. Then you have to force them to believe. Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus would not have been able to make their peoples obey their new structures of authority for long if they had been unarmed. Okay? Now, I don't think that's ambiguous. Moses' success in keeping the people unified was through his arms. And that is not the way it's written up in the Scripture. Okay? Now, I'm pointing this out because Machiavelli is not shy about, as I've already told you, about changing the account of things. Okay? Whether it's the Bible or whether it's ancient Roman history or whatever it is, he will change the account of things to suit his own purposes. So that's partly what he's doing here. He's changing the story to suit his purposes. But also he's putting a wedge in people's beliefs about this very important figure. Okay? So I hope that you can see how this might be seen as a demoralizer or a criticism of traditional beliefs. And those who have those beliefs might see what Machiavelli says is somewhat threatening. Okay? Today we're kind of used to deconstruction and remanipulation and questioning of everything, but in these days that was not the case. So such a teaching would be seen as threatening to people's beliefs. This is just a very poignant thing to say, and it sort of sums up his belief about leaders, whether they're religious leaders or secular leaders. If they're armed, they conquer. If they're unarmed, they're ruined. Arms are very important. Okay? You can't lead just by the use of your spiritual authority if you do not have that. All right? So the most cynical interpretation of this is that Machiavelli is suggesting that Moses used religion as a tool. But Machiavelli is completely overturning the traditional notion of Moses' role, and therefore calling into question religious leaders generally, which was not an unusual thing. It was starting to happen at this time in relation to the Catholic Church. The Reformation completed that questioning. Okay? People were beginning to wonder, are religious leaders always sincere, or do they sometimes use religion for their own purposes? This was a new thought. Okay? And so by turning to Moses, he too is agreeing with that thought in a way, and furthering that thought. Right? But also he's admiring it. Now, the Protestant reformers didn't admire it. Okay? They wanted to bring religion back to its purity. They thought that the church had become corrupt, and they wanted to change that. Machiavelli, on the other hand, admires it. Okay? So he's not a reformer in that sense. Instead, he wants to show people how it can be used, and used effectively to make things better, to unify Italy, to make people believe, strong enough to fight for their country. All right. So, that gets him started, and that gets us started in understanding Machiavelli's perspective. He takes a great icon of Judeo-Christianity and turns it on its head, so to speak. Okay? Calls it into question. It shows a different way of looking at religion, which he repeats throughout this book. Okay? When he says the best use of religion for the prince is to appear to be faithful while not being faithful. Okay? Machiavelli says here, the man of virtue, the prince of virtue, conquers fortune. Okay? Now, fortune is a concept that he develops pretty well in here. It's just basically luck, the things that happen to you in life. And there's two kinds of people. There's the type of person, as I say, who sort of accepts their fate. And he thought too many leaders were like that, didn't try hard enough. And then there are those leaders who look at it as an opportunity and who change their fortune as a result of what life throws them. Okay? Machiavelli advises a new way of looking at it entirely. He says, a smart prince is one who looks at fortune, or what life throws you, as putty or clay. Okay? Material that can be used. You should see everything around you as material that can be used. And not despair, but rather think creatively and cleverly. He needs to see what he can do as being sort of the sculptor of that clay. Which is a really attractive way to think of yourself as a leader. Taking that clay, the people, the natural occurrences, whether they're good or bad, okay? The things that life throws you, when the enemy attacks, for instance, or when the plague comes through. All right, whatever life gives you, taking that, using it as clay, and impressing upon it your form. Okay? Not just any form, not just order, but the expression of your own personality. Machiavelli wants to appeal to the prince to say, this can be a monument to you. You can build a monument to yourself. Because why does a prince do all the things he does? Hopefully not just to be rich, which you can do without being a prince, but because you want to create something lasting that will continue your fame long after you're dead. Machiavelli really thought that the prince would be attracted to that appeal, to continue his fame long after he's dead and make a monument to himself. So he says the prince needs to look upon the people and all the other things as clay upon which he can impress his own form, his own image, right, as a monument to himself, and therefore transform any bad luck into good luck. So one of the chief aspects of Machiavellian virtue is this flexibility that so many people lack. Okay?
whether they're in leadership positions or not. They never sit back and think, okay, plan A didn't work. How can I make this stuff work? Okay? Once plan A doesn't work, a lot of people just throw up their hands and they wallow in it. They can't figure out what to do next. Machiavelli wants somebody for whom, if plan A doesn't work, they say, great, this is an even better thing to do, okay? And they continue to be like that. The person who can continue to adapt to the situation is going to win over the inflexible person every time, okay? It's not going to work. You know, some part of the inflexible person's plan is not going to work and they're going to be stymied. The person with flexibility is never going to be stymied. And flexibility includes this notion of creativity and amorality, because one chief way in which people can be inflexible is in their morality, in Machiavelli's view. So they have to be able to see all possibilities and not be limited by a moral framework, by a political framework, by their own ego or anything else from doing what they can do to improve their situation. Here's a guy who was a hero to Machiavelli in a lot of ways. He was such a good example of virtue as we've just described it. He could take any situation and work it to his advantage. And he appears in chapter 7, Cesare Borgia. Okay? Cesare Borgia, as you know from the video, was actually the son of Pope Alexander, which was not supposed to happen. Okay, there was the ideal of celibacy then as well as now, but back then, I mean, the video really told it like it was. Okay, back then the church was experiencing a lot of corruption, and it was really rather open, and this was what got the church into trouble and caused so much discontent. It was really rather open, so much so that people knew that Cesare Borgia was a son of the Pope. Okay. Now, you would think that that would be a real drawback to your popularity. That maybe people wouldn't want to have anything to do with you. You know, I mean, if they were good Christians, they'd want to stay away. You know, be disgusted with the whole thing. He had some uphill climbing to do. Okay, so Cesare didn't rely upon popularity. Okay, he relied upon his own cleverness, and he was very clever. And he did use his relationship with Alexander to his benefit, because Alexander wanted to do something for his son. He wanted to use his own political power to help his son. And so Cesare didn't say, oh my gosh, you know, no way, I'm going to do this all on my own, like a lot of kids do. He said, I'm going to use whatever he can give me and whatever else I can get too. All right? So Machiavelli says he did all things with prudence and virtue. And Machiavelli tells this story. He says his father helped him take the Romagna. Now, the Romagna is the area just north of the Papal States. Your map at the front of your book shows you that. Let me just switch back here for a second. Okay. Here's the Papal States, and they extend across the whole peninsula here. Here's the Romagna. Okay. You can see it right here. And I think it extended up to about here. So you can see it would have added on to the papal lands. All right. Okay. Okay. How come all the people who talk sit right in the front row? I've been wondering that all semester. Anyway, so what did his father do? Well, his father used his alliance with the French to bring in auxiliary troops. Those were French troops that he could use. Okay, so Cesare used them. And also his father bribed all the notable people in the area who might otherwise oppose them with money, but often with promises of offices that Cesare would give them status and position, right? If they would not fight him and would support him. And this worked wonderfully. Okay? No one opposed him. Borgia was able to ride in and take this land without any opposition to speak of. Okay? So he got it easily. And believe me, Machiavelli thinks that if you can get it easily, you should. There's no reason why you should do it the hard way. Okay? Now the problem was for Borgia that after he got there, things were not so easy to control. And he didn't have to deal so much with the elites who had been subdued by his father's actions, but he did have to deal with all that crime, because what he found was that this land had not been well ruled at all, and there was a lot of crime. There were a lot of bandits, there was a lot of marauding, and so, the people were frightened to death, and the bullies, the thugs, basically ran the place. All right? So he knew he had to do something about this. And he had to do something quite dramatic. This is a great example of using cruelty well and of using it very quickly up front in order to accomplish, basically peace and good order. So he tells the story of what Cesare Borgia did. Halfway down page 24, he says, once Borgia had subdued the Romagna, he found that it had been under the control of weak nobles who had rather exploited than governed their subjects, and had rather been the source of conflict than of order. With the result, the whole province was full of robbers, bandits, and every other type of criminal. So he decided it was necessary, if he was going to make the province peaceful and obedient to his commands, to give it good government. He put Mr. Ramiro de Orco, a man both cruel and efficient, in charge and gave him absolute power. Okay, so he took a henchman and he put him in as governor, more or less. And he said, do whatever it takes. Okay? De Orco, in short order, established peace and unity and acquired immense authority. At that point, the Duke decided that such unchecked power was no longer necessary, for he feared people might come to hate it. So, in other words, De Orco used a lot of cruelty, terrorized people, all right? And then, Borgia began to think, well, if I let this go on much longer, people will hate me. And he accomplished his task anyway. There was no more crime, okay? So what did he do? Well, he says, so Borgia established a civil court in the center of the province, placing an excellent judge in charge of it and requiring every city to appoint a lawyer to represent it before court. So he actually established a judicial, institution there. He put up courts, he put up advocates for the various areas in the Romagna. And since he knew the harsh measures of the past had given rise to some animosity towards him, in order to purge the ill will of the people and win them completely over to him, he wanted to make it clear that if there had been any cruelty, he was not responsible for it, and that his hard-hearted minister should be blamed. He saw his opportunity and exploited it. One morning in the town square of Cesena, he had Mr. de Orco's corpse laid out in 2 pieces, with a chopping board and a bloody knife beside it. This ferocious sight made the people of the Romagna simultaneously happy and dumbfounded. Yes. So he made an example of Mr. de Orco. Now, he knew what de Orco was up to, okay? He knew because he ordered him to do it. So, but then when he was no longer useful, and he wanted to change the minds of the people, he had to do something very dramatic. What could be more dramatic than having him cut in half, drawn and quartered, and thrown into the town square for everybody to see? So the people would have thought that Cesare didn't know what his governor was up to, and that he had punished him. And so what would their mood be towards Lorenzo, or towards Cesare?
He saved us.
Yeah, thankful, right. He saved us. He's come into the rescue. I mean, he obviously didn't know what was happening, all right? So he gets the best of both worlds. He gets their fear, which they're not going to change right away. I mean, if people have been treated very harshly, they're going to have that fear. And in the back of their mind, there's going to be some wondering, okay, what could happen next? And did Cesare really know or didn't know, okay? So they're going to have that in mind. But at the same time, they're going to be so happy and grateful, and they're going to respect him. And what Machiavelli knows is that in order to lead well in the long run, you have to get people's respect. Okay? You have to get their basic acceptance, or it's very, very difficult. So this is the way that Borgia did it. Okay? Now, yes, it was wrong to order Yorko to be so cruel and to kill people without any sort of justice. And it was wrong to stab Yorko in the back and kill him, even though he was just doing what you told him to do, too. Okay? But it worked. And so Machiavelli doesn't dwell on whether it was right or wrong. He knows that from the moral perspective it's wrong to do these things. But on the other hand, look what he obtained. Peace, tranquility, a new territory that he might be able to turn into something productive. People might actually be able to start making some money. You know, their families might be better off as a result of those actions. And Machiavelli looks at that. Okay? He looks at the outcome. And the outcome is better. Okay? Before, they were terrorized by bandits. They could never, save up anything. They could never make any money. There was a great deal of poverty. Now, with the order established, even though it was established at a price, a fairly high price, now they have a chance to build and be productive. Okay? And they're going to forget what happened in the past. And this is interesting. Machiavelli really thinks that people look forward. They look at what's happening right now. They don't think about the past, okay? Or they don't dwell on it, if good things are happening now. Now, Machiavelli says Cesare was such a genius that he had even thought further ahead and anticipated that his father was getting old and would die, and that he would need to find a new pope in order to continue this relationship, okay? So that, the two could work together. And so Borgia had actually started the process of corrupting the cardinals who would be in charge of making that decision. And he was trying to influence them through money, I'm sure, through promises and so forth. Okay? It's a terrible picture. But Machiavelli admired that. He admired that Borgia had thought that far ahead. A Machiavellian leader thinks multiple steps ahead at what needs to be done, not just at the moment. He doesn't just think about the moment. So Cesare had started that, but ultimately he didn't succeed, and that's because he himself got sick, okay? Which isn't exactly a fault. It's just there are some things that life throws you that you can't fight back from, okay? Namely, illness and death. Machiavelli didn't think there was any way that one could get around that. Okay? So, Alexander died, but Borgia was already sick himself. And then he says Borgia also died before he could complete his vision. But he said he did as well, given his circumstances, as any leader possibly could. And so he should be a model. This is what he says on page 26. It seems to me he ought to be set up as I have done, to be imitated by all those who by fortune and with others' arms have ascended to imperium. Okay? So he does note that he had fortune. Fortune was his relationship with his father, which he made into good fortune. Could have been bad. Okay? He could have been a total failure because of that relationship, but he turned it into something positive. And also, he used others' arms, the French auxiliaries. He didn't use his own. So those are two qualifications. It would be better to not use others' arms in particular. I mean, you have to use what fortune gives you. But Machiavelli tells us time and again, it's better to use your own arms. And in fact, in another part of this book, he does show how before he died, Borgia had gone from the auxiliary troops to mercenaries and then to his own fighting force. And that was the best. Okay, so Borgia did understand that using other people's arms is not the best. And he had done something to change it. It's better not to have such fortune, okay, you might say, or not to rely as much on your father as he did. But if that's what you've got, and Machiavelli always goes on what you actually have, not on what you would like to have or what would be ideal, then he did the very best that he could with what he had. Okay? But it is kind of ironic that in the end, what caught up to him was something no one can avoid, and that is disease. All right. Well, you don't need to start copying this down because I'm going to put this back up on the screen next time. But what we're going to do is we're going to compare Borgia to this other character, Agathocles. So pay special attention to that as you're reading in chapter 8. We'll see you next time.